From the Western Mass News studios in Springfield, this is Western Mass News Getting Answers with Dave Mattson.
Thanks for joining me for this week's edition of Western Mass News Getting Answers. Every week, I'm joined by federal, state, and local leaders and newsmakers to talk about the issues that impact you. And my guest this week, we're getting answers from Congressman Richard Neal. We'll tackle the investigation into the January 6th attack on the Capitol, the expanding social safety net for Americans, and the current rise in COVID-19 cases across the country, and lots more. Congressman Richard Neal, good to see you.
Great to see you, Dave. Happy to see you back.
It's nice to be back. I can't believe you've been in Congress since 1988, chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, and it's good to see you in person because the last two times we've done an interview has been over Zoom.
Well, I think it's very hard to replace the social interaction that comes in public life. And I think we all understood in the early stages that perhaps the electronic connection might be a necessity. But as time has gone on, so now has the resistance to Zoom. People want to get back in, I think, to the interactions that really make for a good public discourse.
Nothing like sitting across from one another.
Well, particularly in negotiating. It's very hard to negotiate over Zoom, but if you're going to negotiate a big package, it's much better to have people in the room so you can take the temperature.
Last time you and I talked was not really long after the January 6th insurrection. We're talking, about at least trying to get a committee going to investigate that. Of course, the battle between Republicans and Democrats playing out. Speaker Pelosi saying no, she doesn't. There were 5 members, I think, from the Republican Party she said no to. Where are we with this? And given the fact that it's just kind of stalled right now, can we get a good investigation out of this whole thing?
We need a good analysis as to what happened on January 6th, and it ought to be fact-driven, and it ought to be based upon the evidence that's in front of us. When you have one member of Congress from Georgia say that it looked to him as though it was just a regular tourist day at the Capitol, I was trapped in my office inside of the Capitol, just off the floor of the House of Representatives, with a giant table pushed against the door and with Capitol police officers in the office with me with their guns drawn. This idea that somehow this was a tourist day or that the former president should not tell us exactly what happened inside of the White House on that day when he was advised by the Republican leader in the House to dial back the demonstration. And I happen to believe in this instance here that Speaker Pelosi is entirely correct about who ought to serve on this committee. She has chosen Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. They are both Republicans. They are well regarded within the House of Representatives. But most importantly here, they voted to certify the election of Joe Biden. In the end, that's what part of this is about.
Right.
And I think one of the most important parts of that day was at 3:30 in the morning, actually it would have been on January 7th by then, we went back into the House of Representatives. It looked like a war zone. And we voted to confirm the result of the November election in which Joe Biden won. This idea that's being permeated and promoted that somehow this election was rigged, there is no evidence to support that conclusion. And responsible people across the country have adopted the right position, including Senator Dole over the weekend. He said this idea that this was about fraud is nonsense, and that's the case. It is nonsense. And promoting these theories are not helpful.
Now, Liz Cheney has said that Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy has taken every opportunity to block the investigation. Did you see that?
I think he has, and I think that part of it is that in the early stages of the investigation, it was clear that he blamed the former president. And as it moved on, he looked at public opinion polling with the base of the Republican Party and decided that there was an element of risk that was involved, and therefore he couldn't pursue what his obligation was as the Republican leader in the House, and that was to come to a conclusion based upon the evidence. I must tell you, as I looked out the window that day, and the windows in my office were all smashed and broken, the idea that this was just a nice, pleasant day at the Capitol, when you watched police officers under assault, you watched the very Statuary Hall and the rotunda of the Capitol, again under assault by these groups who marauded through the halls of Congress and were looking for the Speaker of the House. They were looking for the Vice President of the United States. Mike Pence did the right thing. He voted to confirm the result of the election.
he was looking at the Constitution and the right thing to do.
Well, that's not a small matter. I mean,
No.
the Constitution prescribes when elections take place in America. We know right now when the next presidential election is going to take place.
Sure.
And we also understand when the next round of congressional elections are going to take place. Those dates have been set. I don't think it's helpful, dating back all the way to Richard Nixon, who was encouraged to do a recount with Jack Kennedy because of the results of what happened in Chicago, in the state of Illinois. Nixon decided that it was not worth it for the country's fabric, and he accepted the result of the election. Until that time, the narrowest in American history. And I can take you to Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. I can take you clearly to Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon. When Humphrey and Nixon, the tide had turned on the other side, and Humphrey accepted the result of the election, even though it was very close. Elections have meaning on the basis of the fact that the people have spoken. And this idea that there was widespread fraud in this election across the country, there is no evidence of it. The idea that there were people that were masquerading with false names is nonsense.
Where do you see this heading? I know the Speaker named another Republican to the committee, and he's accepted. Do you see this getting resolved within the next week or so?
I think that the Speaker is determined to go forward with it.
Yeah.
And Leader McCarthy has said he's going to go forward with his own investigation. But I think that Congressman Kinzinger and I think Congresswoman Cheney, they are going to copper fasten the credibility of this investigation by sitting on the committee. And the Speaker is determined to go forward with it, and she should.
In the direction we're heading, do you have a fear that an insurrection like January 6th could happen again?
I think it was very frightening, and I also think that there's an important element to our constitutional history, and that is that it's not about the personalities, it's about the institutions, the reverence that we should hold for the institutions, understanding that it is still the First Amendment, the cornerstone of American democracy, which gives us the right to disagree, it gives us the right to assemble, to criticize the government, free speech, free press, all of those things. And that's part of our obligation in a democracy, understanding that there's always going to be a second opinion for good reason, but not to miss the point that the fabric of our democratic system is based on trust. Mm-hmm. And you cannot, I think, undercut that by suggesting that the election was rigged. So 4 years ago, when the president won, he had campaigned in the last few weeks saying the election was rigged, and then he won. This time around, he said the election was rigged, and he lost. And I think that here, elections are meaningful because everybody has a chance. The turnout was the highest since the McKinley race. And I think it spoke well of our democracy. On election night, there was no doubt. The same margins that had prevailed for the former president 4 years before were reversed in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And Joe Biden won.
What's the hold that Donald Trump has over Republicans? What do you see it as?
I think that our democracy in conflict, which has been amplified by social media, it now allows more conspiracy theories. I think it now allows more fringe candidates. And I think that it allows a more rapid response in terms of public opinion. I mean, there used to be the good pause, as you and I know from our time when you were a first-class reporter here at 40. I mean, there would be kind of a period of reflection. Mm-hmm. What started on Monday might be a different story by Wednesday, and certainly we came to analysis over the weekend, and we thought that as the new cycle started that we had actually been possessed by facts.
Yeah. Yeah, where'd the facts go?
Where are the facts? I mean, now people have these opinions, and some of them can be pretty bizarre. There's a pretty good piece today on disinformation and how you can hire out for disinformation today in the Times. And in fact, it's a fascinating piece. Not that we didn't suspect it anyway, but now you just, if you want to pay top dollar, you can get somebody to spread all the disinformation that you desire. It is not helpful to democracy.
No.
It is not helpful to a representative democracy where we say that ideas in the public square ought to be meritorious.
All right, Congressman Neal, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, Congressman and I talk about the Biden administration's legislative agenda, including the infrastructure bill and expanding the social safety net, so stay with us. Welcome back to Western Mass News, Getting Answers. My guest this week, Congressman Richard Neal. Congressman Neal, there's a lot to talk about as far as the infrastructure bill and things like that, but President Biden sees infrastructure, climate change, and child care as his top legislative priorities, viewing them as critical to boosting the economy. And as we look what's going on with the economy now, inflation is up. Where are we with the infrastructure bill? I know there's a lot of debate on it this week to at least get it before the Senate.
Well, it's going to happen. And I think that there's a broad recognition across the country that our physical infrastructure has fallen into a broad state of disrepair. Highways, roadways, bridges, airports, rail, certainly, sewer and water. Those are all critical parts of the American physical infrastructure. So I think that there's at least an acknowledgement on both sides that something has to be done, even if there's a disagreement on the size, scope, and expenditure as it relates to what has to be done. On what the president has described as the human side of infrastructure, I think that we could find an agreement there as well. It's going to be more tenuous. It'll certainly be more strained in terms of the discussion, but I do think that we're going to get that done as well. It's not just the roadway that gets us to work, it's child care that with confidence keeps us at work.
Now, these two bills being tied together?
Well, there are these peculiar institutional rivalries that take place. And the process of reconciliation is an arcane procedure in which the Senate will have to decide to cast aside the filibuster, which the leader, Chuck Schumer, has said he's willing to do. And that would mean that you no longer had to reach the threshold of 60 votes. In fact, you could accomplish the outcome with 51 votes, with perhaps the vice president breaking the tie. In the House, we intend to put out our own bill. I've been bringing Ways and Means members up to speed with some pretty complicated issues of revenue and expenditure, and we think that we can accomplish this. I also would say that in terms of the child credit, that has been pretty well met by people everywhere. The pandemic has been really tough. It has changed fundamentally the American economic structure, and it has also changed the way that we are going to go to work in the future. So there's a lot of changes that have come because of the pandemic, and understanding with the pandemic, this was not about malfeasance like 2008 on Wall Street. This was not about corruption. This was about a plague. The Bible describes it, I believe, as pestilence. So these are the considerations we have, but it's going to mean some substantial changes for all of us in the workplace, in social interaction.
Now, I want to touch on this. I read a recent op-ed that says to get things done, the president and Democratic leaders will need to win the support of two opposing groups. And I found this interesting. Skeptical Republicans in the Senate who are intent on blocking the president's agenda, and a Democratic caucus of a wide array of views on how much the government should spend to boost the economy and combat on climate change. Senator Bernie Sanders saying there are 50 Democrats in the caucus. I expect there are 50 points of view. How much of a challenge will that be to the president?
Well, I think we could say the same thing in the House. I mean, if you've ever been to a Democratic caucus, anybody who thinks that there's a monolithic point of view, they'd be sorely mistaken. So the plan here is, in the end, to get to 218 in the House and 51 in the Senate and get the president's signature. I think it's very doable. I think that Senator Sanders has already moved off of $6 trillion, which was his proposal. He's cut that to $3.5 trillion. And I think on the House side, Speaker Pelosi and I, we've offered some flexibility on where we end up, but not to take our eye off the fundamental issue, and that is the greater concentration of wealth in America. There are a lot of reasons why this has happened: technology, skill set, globalization, all of those occurrences, but not to miss the point that it has happened. So I think that as we witness the economy being reopened, we want to make sure that the opportunity for growth exists for all members of the American family.
Do you see something happening on either one of these bills before your August break? Or is it...
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I don't want to state flatly yes or no, but I do know that something's going to happen because we're going to prevail on this, yes.
Where are you in as far as Republicans and Democrats, not you in particular, but this party divide where it just seems if one says black, the other one says white, if one says the sky is blue, the other says no, it's dark. Is it, how different is it? Is it worse now than it's ever been?
It's remarkably different. And part of the challenge, I think, again, is that social media amplifies conflict. And there are parts of both political parties that I think you can say, in fairness, are skeptical of any deal with the other side. where the truth is that much of the contact that we used to have with each other, that has now been compromised. And I don't think cable TV newscasts have helped either. No. I think that, in fairness, another statement I think that you would recognize from your time in media, we live in a time where there is more choose-a-side journalism.
Yeah.
And I think that highlights and reinforces the incendiary nature of the rhetoric. So there's still many of us that are committed to what we call the regular order. And that means amendments, open debate, and at the end, as Mick Jagger, who I believe turned 78 today, used to say, you get what you need.
Isn't it nice to think that we're both younger than Mick Jagger? Can't move like him.
Well, he's going on tour again, too, so I think that's another indication of staying power.
Crazy stuff. It's when you look at expanding the social safety net, is that bill also the president's hope to advance climate action?
Yes, I think that they would like to include that certainly on the Senate side, and we would react favorably. The GREEN Act that I helped to author, which was the most substantial achievement in legislative history as it relates to climate, passed the House a year ago. We think that in the House that's a good starting point for the discussion. But I do think that we're talking about power storage, we're talking about more renewables, electric vehicles, and all of those issues. And you can't miss the point of what's happening with weather everywhere, including the Pacific Northwest, even as the two of us speak, and what's happened in Germany recently. These are not any longer isolated occurrences.
No, these are extremes.
These are extremes, yes.
All right, Congressman Neal, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk to the Congressman about tax increases on corporations and the wealthy, Secure Act 2.0, the push to end legislative filibuster, we touched on that, and the rise in COVID cases across the country. Welcome back to Western Mass News Getting Answers. I'm pleased to have Congressman Richard Neal as my guest this week. Congressman, let's talk about tax increases on corporations and the wealthy. The president's estimated $3.6 trillion in tax increases on that. Is that in flux?
This is about infrastructure.
Right.
This is not about being punitive. This is about infrastructure. This is not about tax reform. This is about infrastructure. And we all would acknowledge that to boost America's infrastructure, which incidentally, as you prescribed earlier in the conversation, used to be the easiest thing to do in Congress, and now that's caught up in part of the polemical morass. But that we intend to get this done. We have, on purpose, avoided revenue forecasts. I mean, people will say, well, what's your idea? What's your plan? And I've been using the refrain, well, that's like saying to me right now, how would we get tickets for the Baltimore Orioles going to the World Series? It's not going to happen, so why would we volunteer until we've reached some sort of consensus with the Senate and the President how to do this? And I think that bolstering the IRS makes some sense. There's a lot of revenue there that could be captured, largely because of the now the number of audits that have declined markedly over the years. Yeah. We don't have the same sort of firepower inside of the IRS that outside accountants and tax attorneys have. So I think that's one area of revenue. I also think that the tax cut that took place in December of 2017, I think that left a lot to be desired. The growth that was prescribed because of it really didn't happen. And my hunch is that you could argue pretty forcefully that the people that received the bonus of that benefit were overwhelmingly at the top. So I think being fluid here on revenue forecast makes a good deal of sense.
Let's talk about Secure Act 2.0. I know this is the first major retirement legislation in about 15 years. You're working with Republican Congressman Kevin Brady of Texas on the legislation. Exactly what is it, and how will it impact people?
We want to make it easier for people earlier in life to set aside prescribed numbers of dollars for the purpose of retirement. Mm-hmm. Retirement is supposed to be a three-legged stool. It's supposed to be some personal savings, a retirement plan, and the bedrock guarantee of the genius of Mr. Roosevelt's Social Security plan. The earlier one starts saving for retirement, the better they're going to be. And in the Secure Act, and now what we're doing, Secure 2.0, which has already passed the Ways and Means Committee, unanimously, by the way. And Kevin Brady and I have worked on this together. We're both pretty vehement about what retirement savings potential ought to look like. But for people that are 55 and older, these provisions of catch-up are handsome.
Yeah.
You can set aside an awful lot of dollars to catch up if you were caught, for example, in midlife, which many of us were and are, overpaying for college costs. So this gives you a chance to say, okay, looking in the rearview mirror, what might I have done differently? And now at 55, through working a bit longer, I can catch up. So the challenge is always going to be with the 401k plan as opposed to the defined benefit, is that it is much attached to the rise and success of the stock market, which for the moment is doing pretty well.
Doing well. You know, you talked about college education, and I know Senator Warren has been tied to this greatly as far as forgiving up to $50,000 in debt. Is that going to fly? I'm
not sure. I would like to provide some relief. I think that's a good idea. At the same time, I think that a sort of a blanket amnesty on debt from students, there has to be, in my judgment, some limit as to what the Rockefellers ought to be having for debt forgiveness.
Right.
I mean, there are people that can pay. And I think that for those who are stuck at home, living in the parents' attic after graduation, that's a different challenge. So I do think that some limits on income might be the way to proceed. But I'm open to it, yeah.
Yeah, just not. COVID cases across the country. The CDC saying COVID is now a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Did you think once we had the vaccine introduced, we would find ourselves at this point in time in July of 2021?
No, but the issue right now is not about the vaccinated, it's about the unvaccinated. That's the question. And I think that as the variant has spread, the evidence is also pretty compelling that if one were to get the variant, symptoms are fairly mild, but for those who are unvaccinated, it still is a death threat. And I just don't think you can waltz around this one without hitting the science of it clearly. And the science says, get vaccinated.
Dr. Fauci said yesterday there are really two kinds of America. Is this reluctance to get the vaccine, do you think, just symptomatic of what we see in the split between the country itself?
I think part of it is the rejection of science.
Yeah.
I think part of it's the rejection of fact, or as a former member of the White House staff said, we just embrace alternative facts. If you recall what this was like 16 months ago, when you couldn't get ventilators, when people were dying on oxygen machines, and the understanding with the following numbers, 600,000 Americans have died, millions infected. An estimate the other day that in India, despite the number that's been published, that number could be closer to 4 million, just alone in India, where we've all thought that the number well may be worldwide at 4 million. This is dangerous. And the vaccination levels, about half of the American people have been vaccinated now. For the life of me, I don't understand why you wouldn't be vaccinated. And that's back to the original point we made about facts. And the anti-vaxxers across the country, they have offered this suggestion that somehow that the vaccine is going to cause people to die within 2 or 3 years. There's no evidence to support that conclusion. So trust the science of it, trust the levels of vaccination, and recall, Dave, for the two of us, what polio was like in the 50s and 60s. That was every mother's biggest fear. And I often point out the example that I recall, and that was you stayed out of fresh water in August.
Yeah.
And until Dr. Salk came up with the vaccine that has been eradicated in America, polio, eradicated.
And we forget about that.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have measles vaccinations.
Yep.
You know, I don't understand why those who have, without scientific foundation, invented these theories about vaccinations.
Crazy. I find it to be insane. Congressman, we are out of time.
Great to see you, Dave.
Always good to see you. I want to thank you for being here this week, and thank you for joining us. Until next Sunday morning at 11:30, I'm Dave Mattson. Stay safe, stay well. If you can, join me next week when my guest will be President and CEO of Bay State Health, Dr. Mark Kirouac.